So yeah, I've been wondering if it would be better to like maybe legalize all drugs, but then tax them for the full cost of negative externalities, or if you make like all drugs illegal, but then you don't criminalize them quite as much because that is obviously, it's obviously quite unfair and, creating lots of, destroying lots of people and incurring lots of costs. So I think definitely this sort of very punitive approach to drug consumption is excessive, but I'm also at the same time I'm very much anti-drug consumption. But I'm not really sure if yeah, I'm not sure if it's better to make it legal and tax it or to make it illegal but then not punish quite so much. But the thing is, if you're going to be making it illegal, like most drugs, recreational drugs are illegal currently. Um, and if you're going to be consistent, well, tobacco would be an logical target. You say, I think some narcotics just shouldn't be allowed. I'm I'm kind of torn, and I'm thinking, well, overall, if you're going to fight for some policy, you should kind of if you're not sure which is best, well, just stick with what you're already doing. Stick with what sort of works, and don't try to just completely change everything. If there like isn't an obvious indication that it would be better to completely change things. So like for now, most narcotics are illegal, right? And the thing is, if we're going to be like consistent, I think that it would make sense to also ban tobacco. Um, because in fact, like it's also responsible for huge amounts of medical costs and societal costs. And also, there's the issue of secondhand smoking. Lots of people aren't really able to avoid it, especially kids. And so, like, even if it's like, the societal costs are paid for through like taxation on tobacco, and for now, taxation on tobacco is still much too low to properly take into account the societal costs. Well, even if you do that, like you're still going to have the issue of some kids that are going to be exposed to secondhand smoke, and like okay, at the level of society, like their illness that's going to be caused from secondhand smoke will have been paid for through the tax on tobacco, but it's still kind of shitty for the kids who have grown up in an environment that had secondhand smoke. So that's why I mean there are some good arguments for making tobacco illegal. Now, it's true, the problem is that whenever you make something illegal, it creates a black market, which leads to criminality. Um, and that is very much a problem. And that's the problem currently with the fact that lots of recreational drugs are illegal. And in fact, like, all these like terrible drug cartels that you have are kind of, their power derives from that. So like literally, if you legalized all drugs, um, then you wouldn't have those cartels anymore. Although if you tax them, if you tax the drugs to fully take into account the negative externalities, then you might, because you could still have a black market for tax-free drugs, which would be a lot cheaper. So that's again the problem of, even if you legalize stuff, if you properly tax them, then you still might have a black market. Um, so maybe like tobacco in any case, like it really, it doesn't really bring you much like pleasure. Like at least food, it has like a kind of unique taste. Tobacco, I mean, honestly, I don't know, I just don't feel it's something all that incredible. And like I don't think it's all that much of an issue to just ban it. Um, and again, there's the issue, like I said, there's the issue of secondhand smoke. And I mean, I think most people who consume tobacco regularly, as opposed to maybe just very occasionally, most people who consume it regularly probably wish they didn't, and they're just not able to not do it. And I think most people who consume tobacco regularly, they started when they're pretty young and they just got hooked and they can't stop. Um, so you say also if they're illegal, they cannot be regulated in production. Yeah, that's another issue. If that's true, um, and that's another problem. And so like it's not clear what the best policy, what the best solution is. There are pros and cons for legalizing and illegalizing, and I think yeah, there's no proper policy, but what I do want is a policy that at least aims to be rational and consistent and overall just beneficent. And I think so far, I think well, it's kind of weird how you have this, ultra strict war on drugs for lots of stuff, but then tobacco is legal. It doesn't make sense to me, so I'd prefer more consistency. So I think the the best way to achieve that consistency without changing too much stuff is to make tobacco illegal, but then to just to not like put people in prison for consumption of any drug, but just like apply a fine or just make it much less of a big deal. Um, that would be what I would suggest. And alcohol, I wouldn't make illegal because, like, in any case, you even have small amounts of alcohol, just like in fruits and stuff. And also, like, it's just like parts of recipes for like lots of food dishes. You put like some beer, you put some wine in it. So it'd be kind of weird to, it'd be like pretty oppressive to not be able to do that, especially because since when you put the like alcohol in a dish that gets cooked, most of the alcohol actually evaporates away. So you're not even going to be consuming alcohol at that point. And of course, that could also be an argument for not taxing alcohol because some people might use it to put in a dish and then they wouldn't actually be consuming alcohol. But I think the problem is that there just isn't really any way to know what people are going to do with it. So I think I think you're just kind of stuck with having to tax it, and then just too bad for the dishes that are affected by that. Um, but yeah, that is a slight issue. But at least they won't be illegal that way. They're just going to be more expensive, and so I think, and I mean, it's good also because that way it's a source of tax revenue, and with that kind of source of tax revenue, well, you're gonna be able to tax things less elsewhere. And for instance, well, we saw so alcohol consumption was what 8 liters, 8 liters. So presuming that with a tax like that, it can be brought down to maybe like 2 liters per person per year, then you'd have like a tax revenue of what did I say? It would be like $400, right? Because I said $200 per liter, so maybe $400. And then, so I'm just thinking the U.S. example because I know already sort of know about. I'm sort of familiar with the figures. So in the U.S. you have approximately 300 million people, and if you multiply that by $400, well, if we say $500, then that's going to be 150 billion dollars of tax revenue from alcohol, which is not bad because currently I think tax revenue is around 2 trillion, so it'd be in the ballpark of like 8% of tax revenue. You say if rehab were openly available at no cost, I think that limited selling of drugs should be allowed. Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm honestly I'm not sure, but yeah, rehab should obviously we should have policies to like you know set up rehab and just be less punitive, and instead you just have the approaches that various European countries have done more, where you just instead of putting people in prison, you send them to rehab when they're caught with drugs. I think that's a much better policy. Um, yeah, but as you can see, so like I said, the tax revenue for alcohol would be pretty considerable, and then for sugar, well, you'd have also sugar consumption that would be uh, probably about 4 times as much, but taxed 4 times less. So literally, you could earn the same amount from a sugar tax. So also $150 billion. So you'd have $300 billion dollars in tax revenue just from an alcohol tax and a sugar tax. So that would be not bad because it would be more than 10%. It would, I think. Which sounds weird because actually, no, that those figures must be wrong because U.S. government expenditure is much more than that because it's 20 trillion. 20 trillion economy. U.S. government expenditure is almost 50%, so it's 10 trillion. So U.S. government expenditure is actually like 10 trillion. So 300 billion is like 3%. Still, it's already that. But obviously you still need a lot more. You still need a lot more. Um, But yeah, I mean, there's been, you know, lots of countries which have a much less punitive approach, and I think that that would definitely be preferable to the issue of drug consumption. And in fact, I mean, um, people should actually, we should seek out and offer treatment to these people, and free of charge. I think there should definitely be a policy of like helping out people for like drug consumption, and also for like excess like junk food eating also. Um, and in fact, well, the tax revenue, like those 300 billion, for instance, in the United States, could go to funding that. Um, so I think that would definitely be preferable, and that's really what needs to be done. And it's just like so like just frustrating that such obvious policies aren't actually being implemented, because I mean that would honestly be life changing for many people, I think. Um, and it would just overall for society be much better. Um, so that is absolutely something that I fully support, and that is kind of that's my idea. So to recapitulate, so you have a sugar tax, you have um, an alcohol tax, so sugar tax of $50 per kilo, alcohol tax of $200 per kilo. You also have a tax on like artificial sweeteners, on things like like added caffeine and stuff like that. And then drugs, you actually just you keep them illegal. You make tobacco also illegal, but you don't criminalize the consumption, and instead you send people to rehab. And with the money that you obtain through the taxes on sugar and alcohol, you then fund rehab for drug consumption, including alcohol and including like poor eating. Um, I think I think that is the best way to address public health, and I think like expenses in public health could be drastically reduced by doing that. I think that definitely is a possibility. I think um, presumably presumably like the point is that like the decrease of consumption that arises from the tax, well, that decrease in consumption, which would have provided revenue through the tax, well, that's actually an amount of money that society is saving. So literally, it doesn't matter if people consume less and you have less revenue from the tax, because literally it amounts to the same as if people kept on consuming and then you tax that. That's the whole point of fully taxing a negative externality. Um, so that's what should be done. So that's kind of my position on like the issue of like health and drugs and eating, you know, and and so of course then there's the issue of like other foods, but so like I said, like I don't know if I talked to you about this, but like fat, right? Like fat obviously isn't all that great, but in not in moderate quantities, it can be actually very healthy. Like certain fats, we know that olive oil is like healthy. We know that like fatty fishes are very healthy, and there are other fats that there are lots of essential fatty acids that you literally need to consume um, for to survive. So I'm not really convinced that just taxing fat is a good idea. What I think would be better maybe is to tax like cooked fats, like fried fats. So that would definitely be something, because that is obviously not healthy. So I don't know if that would be like a possibility. That would be kind of harder, because you'd have to kind of intervene only after the fat has been cooked. So you can only put the tax. And you say saturated and fats and trans fats are very bad though. Trans fats, yes, absolutely. Trans fats should be completely taxed. Saturated fats, obviously it's linked to cardiovascular disease and stuff, but like there's some controversy as to whether all saturated fats are really all that bad. Um, and it seems like the jury's kind of out about that, because it also seems that saturated fats is present in lots of like meats and stuff that are actually overall like pretty healthy, and have got like lots of vitamins and nutrients and and protein and everything. And it even seems that maybe the saturated fat itself is not necessarily all that bad, at least not for everyone. So I think I think like sugar is more obvious that really just is like bad, whereas saturated fats are definitely linked to cardiovascular disease. But I don't know, it's a bit more, I think a bit more contentious. So I think what really trans fats absolutely should be taxed, and cooked fats definitely should be taxed. So I would limit it to that. Um, and then that's basically it. Like most junk food is mostly junk because of sugar and cooked fats. Then there's the issue of salts, but salt again, you've got like necessary. Some salts are actually necessary. Um, like I mean, not the point is that I mean not some salts, but like literally NaCl is necessary for your health, and um, that of course you actually have enough of it just in like natural foods that you don't need to actually add it. But in fact, it seems that just adding a bit of like natural unrefined salt to your diet, it might actually be beneficial for your health. So it's not necessarily all that great an idea to limit salt consumption. And I mean, if you look at the salt content on lots of junk foods, it's not all that high. And in fact, it's not necessarily higher than like the calories, like the percent of daily value of salt that they bring is not higher than the percent daily value of calorie. So in that sense, I feel that salt is not as much of an issue, and I'm sort of more reluctant to tax salt. Um, so I mean, the daily value, of course, is higher than probably the ideal health consumption. But on the other hand, the ideal health consumption is probably more than just not adding any salt at all. Uh, so I don't know. I don't know. I think salt is sort of more difficult, and definitely all fats should not be taxed. And protein, of course, is good, so you shouldn't tax protein or anything like that. But protein is always associated with meat, and of course, then there's the issue of like meat eating, and so I think meat overall is actually in and of itself is actually pretty healthy, but it tends to be bad when it's like either over cooked at excessively high temperatures or if it's like processed into charcuterie. So so you could potentially considering taxing like charcuterie and stuff, but that again sort of complicates things. Then of course you could potentially consider the environmental impact of like meat, but then all foods actually have an environmental impact. So then you could maybe consider just like taxing, the negative externalities of all food production, which would make food more expensive, which in a way might actually make sense. Um, that is a possibility. But then you got to take into account that all economic production has a pretty significant environmental impact. At that point, you could just like levy a tax on everything and just have a general like you know the thing is that then like how do you determine it? Like then do you have an excise tax, but then based on what? Or a sales tax, but then that's based on price, which is maybe largely more related to things like sales, like supply and demand, rather than the actual environmental impact of the production of that item. So it's kind of hard to really, like it would be pretty complicated to have a tax on, the environmental cost of the production of each item. But of course, ideally, we would do that. We would literally, ideally, have a tax on the negative externality of the production of each item. And I mean, if you did it on literally on all items, you would end up with a pretty significant tax revenue. Um, in fact, it would probably be so significant that you could largely do away with most other taxes. Um, And like I said, like I've been advocating for like a pretty significant personal income tax, but it's true that if you can instead have a tax on like all these negative externalities, that would be a lot better. Um, and like I've also advocated for like the idea of a tax on monopolies, in particular on land. Um, and so that's in the concept of a land value tax, which could literally bring you like a an amount of tax equivalent to about 15% of GDP. Um, and so that's already pretty significant. And your taxes on negative externalities, again, it's probably not going to bring you a huge amount of revenue, but still, like we saw that we could get like something like 2% of GDP potentially from taxing like alcohol and sugar, or like no, it'd be more like 1% of GDP. But you also have a reduction in the costs that amount to like 3% of GDP in my hypothetical example. So I mean, that would also be quite significant. Um, and so I don't know. I don't know to what extent you could properly tax all the negative externalities. Um, and then maybe you could actually tax a bit more than the negative externalities and just focus, just double the cost of the negative externalities and apply that as a tax. And then maybe potentially we could do away with personal income tax. Yeah, you're gonna go, sure, sure. I was pretty much gonna finish with that because I just I wanted to like cover the whole sort of issue of basically the Pigovian taxation, which is what that's about. So that includes, of course, a carbon tax, which should be probably around like $100 per ton of carbon at the very least, I think. Um, and so combined, yeah, you could get a decent amount of revenue from it, but it remains to be seen whether that can eliminate personal income tax, and probably still not. So yeah. Uh, yeah, if you're gonna go, I think I'm gonna just stop here because that kind of covers it. I've actually been recording this, so I didn't record the beginning, unfortunately, but I'm still gonna record this and put on YouTube. All right. Oh, hello, Vols1N, Volk1N. Well, do you want to keep on discussing things since you're here? I don't know. Have you just arrived? Have you been listening to what I said? Um,